In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Hello everyone, I want to welcome you to another exciting episode of TAP Talks, and our guest today is going to be one of my fan favorites and hopefully one of yours, Dr. Melvin Woodard III. He is going to be giving us a sneak preview into his exciting new book entitled Biblical Biology. So without any further spoiler alerts, we're going to discuss the framework of this new brilliant work and what's inspired Dr. Woodard to align Christianity and science. I think it's a fascinating alignment, and I'm sure that you're going to enjoy today's show.
Thank you, my dear. I certainly appreciate it. It's just good to be here. Good to be inside of 2025, and just know that God's going to do some great things this year.
So, Mel, I'm going to throw you a curve right off the bat. What was the inspiration behind your new book, Biblical Biology?
That's a great question to begin with. And in my first book of God's Perfect Timing, it may, when you start books, you're trying to get into it. But literally, there is a little small section on the very first page that I just like to read, which is what led to book number 2.
Okay.
It says, I remember reading the first chapter of Genesis as a child and thinking, God did all that work in 6 days? Really? I didn't realize then that the questions surrounding the creative activity of God would plague my spirit and start me on a lifelong theological journey. What is an accurate way to look at the creation story? Did God actually make the world in 6 24-hour days? And if he did, how does science match up with the Bible's account? It's right there, page number 1, book number 1. And when I went back after that one came out and was thinking about a sequel, it was the very first page that caught my eye and said, we've got to link the Bible and biology. And my good friend, Dr. Marvin McMickle, former president of Crozier Theological Seminary there in Cleveland, Ohio, who was also my mentor in seminary, he gave me one line after he knew the book was out. He says, this is an important work. And I believe it is an important work because for so long, people have stood on either one side or the other. It's either the Bible or it's science. We don't see a bridge. We don't understand that bridge. And I practiced anesthesia for 25 plus years. I've been teaching for the last 15 years, biological sciences, as well as anatomy and physiology. And it just seems to me, with all the science and all the biology in my background, you know what? I need to say something about it. So when we started on this journey with our team about 2.5 years ago, they were like, wow. And I have some ghostwriters who helped me. And they were like, man, I don't think we've ever done anything like this. I don't think we've ever seen anything. And when you go back and you actually look at what books try to merge the thoughts, very, very few in the last 50 years. And if you go out to 100 years, you don't find them. So I just believe timing's right. And certainly we don't mind taking on some pretty big tasks.
Okay, how did you reconcile in the biblical account of creation in Genesis which describes a very purposeful and sequential act of creation by God with the scientific evidence looking at evolutionary theory, which suggests that there's a gradual and often random process of change over millions of years.
Oh, I'm telling you what, great question. You know, for so long, and matter of fact, I probably hold up a couple times. This book, I go in and I talk about the 6,344 years of biblical history that's there. That's why it's called A Literal Approach to Chronology in the Bible. So we map that out. And then I asked classes, and since the last time you and I were together, I've changed high schools where I teach. I now teach at Traders Point Christian High School in Whitestown, Indiana. So being there, our first thing is we want the kids to be Jesus-centered, relationally driven, and educationally focused. So this Jesus Center gives me the opportunity on a daily basis to talk about the Bible, to ask kids those questions in science. So I put it right to them. And even there, you can find the polarity of either Bible or science, and then you get this going back and forth. And I said, what do you guys think? Is the world 6,344 years old, or is it older than that? And so many people feel like I do. When you look at that big blue earth and all that's there, and you think it's only been around as long as the Bible's been here, you start asking yourself some other stuff. So I side with the science, and this is probably where the audience and I might diverge right here. I believe, like science says, that the earth is 4.6 billion years old. Okay? So when you think about it, it's 4.567 billion is what you hear, but let's round it 4.6 billion years old. If I can believe that God is the God of eternity going forward, I can believe that there was an eternal past, as far as I know, that God was fully present, and that earth was just a big old teeming ball. And when I look at that, I realize that evolution, and I teach my classes, I teach my young people this all the time. The definition of evolution is change over time. That's all it means. Change over time. If we look at our own lives, we change over time. Nothing ever stays the same. Even we could say microscopically, it doesn't change. Macroscopic may be something else, but changing over time. So in that microevolutionary thing, we all change. We go from vibrant, young, healthy, skin tight individuals to when we get older, our steps are frail, things change. You get 65, you don't have any hair. Listen, we all realize that things change. But I said, what if we didn't understand the Word of God like we really should understand it? I think the two most powerful scriptures, and there's really three, because there's one about Jesus Christ himself that I think is extremely powerful, John 3:16. But when I look at Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form, it was void, it was empty, but the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I said, somebody tell me how long that was. How long did God sit over the waters? How long was the earth void? Now, if we take the approach that God creates the world in 6 24-hour periods, well, someone might say, hey, he sat over the earth 24, 48 hours, 72 hours, and then said, let it be. I said, no, I don't see it that way. I see a God who believes in taking his time about everything. I said, when we're born, we're not born as mature individuals. We start as a seed, and then we become a mature individual after many, many years. I said, you can't grow a tree, you can't grow a whale, you can't do anything in a 24-hour period. So why do we think that God had to do anything extremely fast in order to prove that he's God. I think it proves even more that he slow walks his change over time so that he gets everything like it needs to be, so that when Jesus Christ comes, it's the world that he wants to step into. It's the world as he needs to find it. And Paul would even say to the Galatians, in the fullness of time. Now, for some people, 6,000 years may be a fullness. For me, I need millions of years. I need billions of years. That's the fullness of time. So the question for me, how do I reconcile it? The Bible is redemption history, but it's not all of history. It's how God redeems man back to himself. And that certainly doesn't take a long period of time. And if you tell me less than 7,000 years, I believe it, because I believe every jot, every tittle in that Bible. But when you tell me creation history, and I realize there are trilobites and stromatolites, I realize that there are the smallest of things. There are mosses, there are plants, there's algae, and then there's the stuff that you and I see on a greater plane, the trees and the grasses and the world as it is. It says there's a mighty God, but he doesn't have to operate at our time. We're going to talk about time probably at some point, but I don't believe that God's time is a 24-hour clock. I believe, if you believe 2 Peter 3, it says, and matter of fact, I quote that in here, which leads me into here. So if 1,000 years is like one day with God and one day is like 1,000 years, it doesn't say it's equal. But if you tell me that one day is 1,000,000 years with God, or 1 year is, or 1 day is 10 million years with God, I certainly believe it, because God does not have to hurry. Nothing has to abide by my little finite mind. And when I open up the possibilities, suddenly I see the Bible in a whole nother light. And now we can fill in some details that maybe we lose because we're so myopic in the way we look at the Bible.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's probably beyond our comprehension when we talk about that aspect of time. And you do bring up Genesis 2, where it talks about the earth was without form and void. So when we go back to that 6-day story and he rests on the seventh day, you really advance an interesting perspective about time in the Bible, and God's time is not our time. And so I think it was easy for us to say, oh, okay, 24 hours makes sense to us because that's what we've created in terms of a clock. But you advance something that suggests God's timing is much more expansive than our timing. And so who says that there weren't millions of years when he just allowed the form, there to be no form and void? And then he talks about this firmament. So they clearly are giving you a description of a state of being, and then he decides to take action. But it would have been on his timing when he chose to do that, because there were no rules in place that said time is 24 hours. None of that existed.
And Wayne Grudem talks about God is not subject to time, but he steps in and out of time as he wishes. So a being like God, and I'm so off in just the finiteness of my mind, but I can imagine if I'm not subject to time, I'm not subject to act when you want me to act, do when you want me to do. I'm not subject to do things in any way, shape, or form so that they make sense to you. I do them so they make sense to me. And when I need to step into time and do some things differently than I've done before, that's when I'll do it. And all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. And what you need to do is wait on the Lord and be of good courage, and he will strengthen thine heart. See, we use those texts, but we use them when they're convenient for us rather than when it's convenient to allow God to exhibit those characteristics long before they make any sense to us. And he's got such great patience. I mean, if he didn't have patience, how do we ever stand a chance of sitting around that king's table if he's not a patient God?
We'd be doomed. We'd be doomed before we got started, right?
Right. Because, I got to do this in 24 hours. No, he does not have to do it in 24 hours. Praise be unto God. He does not act like us.
Okay, we're going to talk about how you reconcile biblical accounts of human origin versus evolutionary accounts of human origin. How, if at all, do you think those theories intersect? Because we have the story that God creates man out of the dust of the earth. We have evolutionists that give us something different in terms of this over time when we look at the different cellular theories and that we evolve over time. Can both of those things happen and both be true?
I certainly think they can. And so reconciling human origin, scientific theories of evolution. Let me start it with something that kind of bridges the last question with this question. Okay. In my book, page 21 of the new book, I talk about the geological timescale. I want the readers to really pay attention to that because it's in table form and it's a timeline that I have adopted, kind of have changed it just slightly, but you can find it out there. And watch this. So I talk about the fact that the formation of the world, of the earth, if we were talking about a 24-hour clock, 4.6 billion years ago would be 12 a.m. on the clock. Okay. So then when the first prokaryotic cells, now this is a great biological word, prokaryotes. Okay, these are different than eukaryotes. We as humans have cell membranes and we've got nuclei. So we're eukaryotes. Prokaryotes don't have these internal parts like we do, but they're the first living creatures. They show up 3.4 billion years ago or at 6:08 a.m. So 6 hours have passed of geological time where God is just enjoying his creative activity. When we start talking about oxygen being accumulated in the atmosphere, we are now at 11:23 a.m., 2.4 billion years ago. Now watch it. Almost 12 hours pass before there's an oxygen apron that can handle life. When we talk about the first eukaryotic cells, that's like us, cells that have multiplicity, have the ability to duplicate themselves through mitotic action, have nuclei and internal things like ribosomes and Golgi apparatuses and peroxisomes and all this stuff we talk from a biological standpoint. Well, they don't show up till 5:29 p.m. Almost 18 hours after God began. Wow. The first animals show up 570 million years ago at 9 p.m. We're just 3 hours away from a 24-hour clock. The first plants show up 470 million years ago at 9:32 p.m. The first vertebrates show up 380 million years ago at 10 p.m. 2 hours left in the first day, if you will. Dinosaurs show up at 225 million years ago at 10:49 p.m. The end of the Cretaceous extinction, 66 million years ago, that's a big extinction period, wiped away all the dinosaurs, all those big animals. That happens at 11:39 p.m. There's a split and I have to clean this up in a little bit. People have often heard that we came from apes. No, we didn't. we're talking DNA wise, there's a huge difference. There's 7% difference between a chimp and a human individual. And you go 7%. No, that is that is millions and millions, matter of fact, billions of DNA nucleotides difference. So there's a split between the chimpanzee and the human lineages 6 million years ago. That's 11:58 p.m. Excuse me. The first members of the genus Homo, we're going to talk about this, is 2.8 million years ago. That's at 11:59:08. Just 52 seconds left on the geological clock. Now, somebody's keeping track. We've only got 52 seconds left. So modern human beings appear 0.2 million years ago, or as I state in the book, at 11:59 and 56 seconds. There's 3.8 seconds on the geological clock when man appears. Now that's scientifically speaking. And somebody says, why do you bring that in if you wrote your first book about God's perfect timing? Because redemption history is not long. It's only 7,000 years out of the midst of it. So when I begin to reconcile that biblical account and the scientific account, I realize that God does things one step at a time. So you say, well, where's that in the book? Page 25, where I talk about one step at a time. He's a powerful God. He doesn't do anything quickly. He does it in his own good time. After all, why would we have all that history from Adam to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, to Moses, to Joshua, to the judges, to the prophets, long before Jesus comes, except God is doing it one step at a time. He's drawing man, he's drawing us into that perfectness of understanding what he wants, what he desires, and how we ought to live. So that's why I'm not so into God wiggling his nose or snapping his fingers or just saying the word. Now, I realize there's a lot of Christians who might come along and hear me say this and say, you're not a Christian. No, I don't. You and I don't necessarily have to agree on how this came along, because God will prove in the end how it comes along. But I am trying to fill in some points, because there's a lot of people who feel like me, who are scientists, who say there is a God, but science hasn't understood enough yet. It's not about proving whether or not there's a God. And for the sake of the listeners, I need them to understand that scientists who came along in the 17th and 18th century, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, they were not atheists. They were believers. As a matter of fact, Darwin was a believer. And I realize he gets a lot of negative rap because of the way we've done with things.
The way his theories have been, the way
exactly.
His theories have been.
But we in fact have to realize that God's ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not ours. Science and God are not at odds. Science is trying to find where God has walked, where he's been, what he's done. And if I just share one last point on this question, anybody who's listening to me needs to ask themselves this. We are made of DNA. And the whole world screams, jumps up and down. Yes, we are. Yes, we are. I said, well, if you understand that we're made of DNA, you tell me where in the Bible it talks about DNA. It doesn't. I've since writing this book, I've been challenging people. It doesn't talk about DNA. It doesn't talk about RNA. It doesn't talk about the 84,000 proteins in our body. It doesn't talk about the 20 amino acids. It doesn't talk about the thousands of enzymes. It doesn't tell us all that we need to know about life. So thank God for science, whether it's biological or physical or geological, astronomical. Thank God for science that says we'll try to get some answers for you. We may not get them during your lifetime. So praise God that your children and your grandchildren will have those answers, but at some point or another, we'll understand it better by and by.
Well,